Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have everybody join us tonight. I'm Laura Wakefield, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of NCHE's webinars this fall. And I just want to encourage you that in addition to tonight's event, if you'd like to go to ncheteach.org under professional learning, and you can register for our next two webinars, which are next week. On Wednesday night next week, we have Women in the American Revolution. And then on Thursday night, what are we fighting for? Teaching the Vietnam War through rock and roll. So, and there's additional ones besides those two, but we have a great lineup coming your way. So for this evening's webinar, Lewis and Clark, what's going on here? You are invited to engage with our scholar by asking questions in the chat or in the Q&A. And I will share those questions with him. He would love for it to be as interactive as possible. So I will share with him your questions as they come out and without interrupting him too often. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce you to our presenter. Elliott West is the Alumni Distinguished Professor of History at the University of Arkansas, where he specializes in the history of the American West, environmental history, and the history of the American Indians. He is the author of many award-winning books, including The Contested Plains, Indians, Goldseekers, and the Rush to Colorado, which won the Francis Parkman Prize, and The Last Indian War, the Nez Perce Story. He was recognized twice as his university's Teacher of the Year and was one of 3 finalists for the Robert Foster Cherry Award for the Outstanding Classroom Teacher in the nation. And if you've had the pleasure to be in a seminar with him before, I can attest that that is a well-deserved honor in his case. He has been a longtime member and presenter for NCHE, and he currently serves as one of NCHE's distinguished advisors. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Elliott, and I will be here to share any questions people put into the chat.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank all of you for attending tonight. As Laura said, I've been active in NCHE since I think it was the Hoover administration. It was quite a while ago. I've loved every bit of it, and I'm certainly glad to do it to continue with that this evening. And I appreciate you again. Appreciate you all signing up. As Laura said, I'm a specialist in the American West, and there can't be too many episodes in American Western history more famous than that of the Lewis and Clark expedition, 1804, 1806. You can say a couple of things about this expedition. It is, as I just said, one of the most famous events of it, not just of Western history, but of American history. It's certainly one of the most closely studied episodes in American history. There is, believe it or not, there's actually a journal, an entire journal dedicated to that expedition. Comes out several times a year. We Proceeded On. It's been studied in the most minutest details. The reason for that, I think there are 2 basic reasons for it. First, it's just a great story. It's an astonishing story. And secondly, it's a story that is documented by what must be, one of the great masterpieces of American literature, that is the journals of Lewis and Clark. And there are, of course, also there are journals of other participants in the expedition as well, Ordway's journal and so forth. So it's this beautifully documented, extraordinary story, just a great American story. And consequently, as I said a moment ago, it's been studied in the minutest details. It's as if American historians and people just interested in American history generally have zoomed in, sort of a tight angle lens on this expedition, studying everything imaginable. How many dogs they ate on the expedition and so forth. And that's great. It's great in the sense that it involves, it engages a good part of the American public in this remarkable episode. But it's also a problem. It's a problem in the sense that this story is so compelling, we get sucked into it in such detail, that sometimes we tend to forget or ignore or not even care about the larger perspective of what was happening. what this can tell us about a much larger story, events, the context that was going on. And that's the subtitle of this webinar. What's going on here? What's going on here? So what I want to do this evening is to try to answer that question, at least in part. What I'm going to do in this webinar is to try to pull back to a wider angle lens and to try to ask the question, what can this expedition of the core discovery tell us about what was going on in the United States at the time, especially in the thinking of American leaders at this time? And secondly, what was going on even more broadly, the history of the North American continent, the history of the Western world generally. So that will be the focus. We're not going to look in any detail whatsoever at the expedition itself. We're going to pull back and ask what that context was. What was happening then? And to do that, we're going to focus on one man, Thomas Jefferson. And specifically, we're going to focus on the document that I had asked Laura to provide for you for this webinar. That is Thomas Jefferson's instructions to Meriwether Lewis, the one he appointed in charge of the expedition. We'll look at that document in a little bit of detail and ask ourselves, what can it tell us about this larger context, this larger story? What can it tell us about what was going on there? What's going on here? Well, first, very, very brief summary of the expedition itself. It was, of course, a brainchild of Thomas Jefferson. He hatched the idea early in his administration. He set this in motion early in 1803. There was preparation by Lewis, who then chose William Clark as his co-partner, his co-captain in this great expedition. They prepared and wintered before the leaving of the expedition on the Mississippi River, and then at St. Charles in near St. Louis. And in May 1804, they set off up the Missouri River, ascended the Missouri River to the middle Missouri River, upper Missouri River in North Dakota, where they spent their first winter among the Mandan and the Hidatsa people. 1805, the following spring, they set off, ascended the Missouri River to its source, crossed over the Rocky Mountains, over Lolo Pass, a very difficult passage, descended on the far side, where they were saved by the Nez Perce people, then proceeded down the Snake and Columbia rivers to spend their second winter, especially miserable winter, at Fort Clatsop on the Pacific coast. The following spring, 1806, they retraced their route. They stayed for a month or so with the Nez Perce before going back over Lolo Pass, over the Bitterroots Mountains, or the Continental Divide. There they split up. Clark went down to follow the Yellowstone River. Lewis explored and found a shortcut, took him over to the Missouri River, where he and Clark met up then, joined together at the Missouri. You can see here where the blue and the red lines come together in this map. And then they proceeded on down the Missouri this time, arriving back to the astonishment of the American public, who figured they were all dead in the spring of 1806. So that is a 2 or 3 minute summary of the entire expedition. But that's, of course, as I said, that's not what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to be asking that question: what was the larger context of this great American story? A couple of points to begin with. First, if we pull back to the widest possible lens, we see that the Lewis and Clark expedition was one of a series of global expeditions. This was a great age of exploration, and theirs was just one of it. It was one that was particular to us, one that is close to our hearts and our identity. But there were so many others. Here are the ones of very famous ones of the British expedition into the Pacific Ocean, which ended up going up, exploring part of the Pacific coast up there, northern Pacific coast. This was back in the 1768 to 1779. This was here. 1792, the Robert Gray expedition. This was an American captain. Well, there was Cook, James. I should have said James Cook, of course, before 1792. Robert Gray, an American explorer, skirted up the Pacific coast there. It was Robert Gray who discovered the mouth of the Columbia River and managed actually to get into briefly the Columbia River, providing part of the American claim to that area. Roughly simultaneous to Gray, George Vancouver, the British explorer, was also exploring in the same area. This was, as I said, a global effort. Here's a fascinating coincidence, one that especially fascinates me. Exactly coincident with the Lewis and Clark expedition during its period from 1805 to 1806. There was an expedition by a man named Mungo Park, who was a Scotch-British explorer sent by the British government to trace the course of the Niger River in Western Africa. Fascinating parallels between the two. Park, like Lewis and Clark, kept his own journal. So we have Park's journal as well as Lewis and Clark's journal to go along here. They're both of them exploring a great river. There was a significant difference in these expeditions. In the Park expedition, everybody died. All members of the expedition, including Park himself, of course, perished at that expedition. Whereas Lewis and Clark famously, of course, only one man died. They only lost one guy to appendicitis. But the point here is that Lewis and Clark's expeditions, like as this very vividly shows us, reminds us, Lewis and Clark's expedition was part of a global effort, especially by European nations and Euro-American nations, to explore large parts of the world. The second point to make about that is that all of these explorations were conducted in large part in an effort to create empires. These were expeditions of empire building, and that includes us, as we'll see in a moment. That's the way Jefferson was thinking in imperial terms. So, according to international law, one way that a nation would establish a claim to a particular area was be the first non-native people to explore an area, to especially exploring its rivers. So, if you'll notice, all of these expeditions have that in common. They're all looking for mouths of rivers. They're tracing the courses of rivers. This is a way that you established an international law, an international court established a foothold, an imperial foothold. So the point to emphasize here, the second point to emphasize, is that in addition to being a great age of global exploration, this was an age of empire building, and we were part of that competition. So all of these expeditions were part of this competing among these various powers, these European and American powers. In our case, this was this imperial contest, this contest of claims of sort of a jockeying for position in North America was extraordinarily fluid and volatile. Look at this map. What you see here is a map of European claims in North America from at the time of Thomas Jefferson's election in 1800. So when Jefferson was elected, if he should have thought on his, during his inauguration, thought about what am I going to do with this thing, this presidency, and if he thought about sending an expedition into the West, he would be thinking about sending an expedition into Spanish territory. In 1800, at the time of his election, this was New Spain. This was New Spain. But shortly after Jefferson's election, in fact, between his election and his inauguration, it switched over to France. In the Treaty of San Ildefonso in 1800, Spain ceded what's now would become the Louisiana Purchase, Louisiana Territory, that is the western watershed of the Mississippi River, ceded that territory, the darker area here, to Napoleon, to Napoleonic France, in exchange for some kingdoms in Tuscany, in Italy. Not long after that, it became clear that Napoleon was not going to follow through on his part of the bargain, and so Spain began to maneuver to try to get it back. So, at the time that Jefferson hatched the expedition, which remember was in late 1802, early 1803, when he looked westward. This wasn't Spanish territory any longer. It was French territory. It was Napoleonic territory, but it was French territory that was being contested with the previous occupant, Spain. And then, of course, in the summer of 1803, it goes to us with Louisiana Purchase. So at the time that Jefferson began the expedition, that is authorized, and Congress authorized it, this was French territory. At the time that they actually left, it was American territory, sort of, maybe. The point here is it's all up for grabs. It's all contested terrain. So when Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery make their way up the Missouri River, they're entering territory that is ours on paper, but it was quite recently French, and soon before that, Spanish. It was currently being contested by France and Spain. It was this real cockpit of competition among nations. And then when they went over and crossed the Rockies over Lolo Pass into what's today Idaho, they were entering an area called the Oregon country here that was claimed not only by Spain, but also in the United States, but also by England and by Russia. So it was really a scramble up there. And immediately to the north of us, of course, was Canada, British territory, and Great Britain, as we'll see in just a moment. Great Britain was also casting very covetous eyes toward the Pacific Northwest. So you get the point, I hope. Lewis and Clark, when they left here, were not entering this sort of unhistoried place apart from larger influences. What they were doing was entering this country that was hotly contested among the most powerful nations of Europe, and including one of Asia, Russia. That was the larger context I want you to begin with in thinking about this. That was key to the thinking. That was foremost at the forefront of the thinking of this man, Thomas Jefferson. Stories argue back and forth about, where did the Lewis and Clark expedition start? Did it start in Pittsburgh, where they first sort of started down the Ohio River? Did it start in Philadelphia, where Lewis was schooled by specialists in medicine and natural history? I think it started in Chancellorsville, Virginia, and more specifically, I think it started in Thomas Jefferson's brain. It started in the skull of this man here. So the question I want you to think about throughout this webinar, for the next 45 minutes or so, is what was he thinking? What was Jefferson thinking when he organized this expedition and when he set it off with his instructions into the far west? All of this I've looked at so far was part of it. Above all, he was thinking in terms of what can I do to establish an American presence and an American foothold for future American expansion, whether it's geographic actual expansion of the American nation or the expansion of American influence of American institutions. He was looking westward covetously, thinking in terms of American empire, whether it's an actual geographical empire of our possessing that country out there, or whether it's an empire of American influence, of American institutions, of sister republics that might be out there. That was at the forefront of his thinking. How do you do that? If you're Thomas Jefferson and you're thinking about that, how do you take that? How does that translate into action? Well, okay, that's where, of course, his orders to Lewis come in. Point number one, the primary goal that he gives to Lewis is find the most direct and the practical way of communications across the continent. What he's saying is find the most direct route possible to the Pacific Northwest. The fastest, easiest way to get to the Pacific Northwest. Well, we pretty much know how that would be, but he didn't. The key point to make regarding this is even Thomas Jefferson's ignorance on this point, how little was known by Jefferson and by everyone else of his society and everybody else in Great Britain and everybody else in Spain and France and the rest of it about this country that they will be being sent into. Let me show you a few maps here about this. Look at this one. You can see quite a dense knowledge, information, specific information about what is today the United States east of the Mississippi River, the area down there to the southwest was Spain, to the north with the British presence up in the St. Lawrence Valley up to Hudson's Bay and so forth. What about over there to the Pacific Northwest? Nothing. Nothing. So little that they put pictures like that. You can see Neptune over there with this trident, and you can see these exotic peoples there. They don't all think about it. It's a huge blank, basically a huge blank slate. Here's another one of looking a bit to the north of what I showed you just a moment ago, into southern Canada and in the far Pacific Northwest. You can see Vancouver Island over there on the coast. So we know something about the coast. Remember those expeditions like that of Cook and of Gray and of Vancouver. So we know something about that. But in the interior, practically nothing. We knew there were mountains, and you see a little slim thread there of what they thought of, how they saw the Rocky Mountains, but practically nothing else. Practically nothing. Here's another one, a map of 1750. You look and zoom in on it, another one of those illustrations. But just below it, these parts are entirely unknown. Indeed, these parts are entirely unknown. What they did know about it was rumor, and a few vague reports of what was there. So Jefferson had to start with that. What was he thinking? So when he told them to find this most direct route to the Pacific Northwest, how did it fit into this knowledge, or rather lack of knowledge, and this impressions here based upon rumor? Well, this man, a British explorer, Alexander Mackenzie, was the first one to begin to uncover what was in fact out there. Mackenzie was sent across Canada. He became the first non-native person to cross North America by foot and by canoe. He crossed over then across Canada, two expeditions. The second one in 1793, he made it all the way to the Pacific Northwest. 1802, Mackenzie published an account of these expeditions, the voyages from Montreal across the continent of North America. Published in 1802, so this was published then not long after Jefferson not been president long. Jefferson, of course, immediately ordered a copy of the book. We know that. The book arrives in the summer of 1802, and Jefferson read it quickly and voraciously. And what he saw, especially at the end of his book, immediately moved him into action. Because what Mackenzie said at the end of his book was, he tells about the voyages, the trip itself, the journey itself. But then he said, excuse me, I've got allergies are terrible out here. What he said was, this place is ripe for the occupation of Great Britain. He calls on Great Britain, he calls on his government to do what they can to move into this area, to establish themselves permanently out in the Pacific Northwest, that is out in what is today Oregon, in Washington, and in British Columbia. And of course, it just touches Jefferson, like a hot poker, and he immediately begins to move into action. It was this book and Mackenzie's voyage, more than any single event, that triggered Jefferson's movement toward authorizing the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well,
can I just interrupt to ask a question related to that? Because Richard was asking about, since the territory was Spanish or French at various times, were there any military units of Spanish or French in the Louisiana territory that the expedition had to worry about?
Yeah, the Spanish, the French, of course, were down to the south in the state of what's today state of New Orleans, the state of Louisiana. The Spanish in the far to the southwest. I'll talk about that in just a little bit more. but nowhere even remotely closing in on moving toward the area of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the fact is, I mean, this is something even historians didn't know until about 20 years ago. But the Spanish were quite concerned about the expedition because they were trying to get this area back from France. So the Spanish sent no fewer than four military expeditions to try to hunt down Lewis and Clark and turn them back. Well, they obviously all failed, but the expedition itself triggered the first sort of significant military movement into this area by the Spanish. And that tells us once again, of course, that how concerned they were with it. This was really close to the top, to the forefront of their thinking. Again, imperial competition. Okay, so Jefferson reads his book. He immediately moves into action to do something about it. And he asks himself, the first thing he asks himself is, do we have any advantages over the British in establishing ourselves out in the Pacific Northwest? And his answer is, yes, we do. That is the key to that first order. Find the most direct route of movement and communication to the Pacific Northwest. Because Jefferson, here's a route this is Mackenzie's route. And Mackenzie made it quite clear that this was an extremely difficult crossing, very difficult crossing. So the British might go out there and establish themselves, but they were going to have a hell of a time doing it. It was very difficult to do. So Jefferson then asked himself, okay, do we have an easier way? Do we have an advantage over them? And he believed that we did. Here's a map that illustrates Jefferson's thinking about the geography of that area out there. Notice a few things about it. You can see, again, the farther east we go in this map, the farther we get down here, the more we know about it. The farther we get over here, the less we know about it. But here's what Jefferson thought. Can you all see my cursor? I hope so. Jefferson thought that if you ascend the Missouri River to its source, the Missouri was the key. If you ascend the Missouri River to its source, there would be this easy crossing of the Rocky Mountains. And then we would find, we know there's this other river out there, the Columbia. Gray, remember, found that. You can follow the Columbia down to the Pacific coast. So the Missouri, with the short passage over the Rockies, the Missouri and the Columbia would provide this water highway, this liquid, super highway, interstate highway that would take us to the Pacific coast. Far better, far easier than that of the British. That was his prime concern. That was the reason for this number one order to Lewis. Confirm this route. Now, Jefferson believed that the Rocky Mountains, you can see here, were in no way a formidable obstacle for them to cross. He believed that they were something like the Appalachians, and he believed that there was a passageway through the Rockies that we would be able to use to get there. So here was his hope. Here was his hope that we would be able to find, that Lewis and Clark would be able to find this easy passage over here that would establish them over here, which would give us a significant jump on the Brits. So we would be able to get up there and establish our presence there before the British were able to make their move the way that Mackenzie had hoped that they would, because they were facing these extraordinary obstacles. So that was the number one goal, number one order. Second, explore the commerce which may be carried on with the people inhabiting the line of the lands that you pursue. So what's he talking about here? What's he talking about, of course, here are Indians. And there were, in fact, scores of different peoples along the route that they would follow, much less the West generally. There were about hundreds of different tribes and sub-tribes and groups out there. It was one of the most ethnically diverse areas on Earth at the time. Specifically for Lewis and Clark, they would be moving up the Missouri through these people. And you could see, even just along the route that they were following, you could see the remarkable variety of peoples. Jefferson had virtually no understanding of who they were. He knew more, of course, about the tribes and those groups along the lower Missouri River, because others had already been up there and described it. Uh, the first the first summer and fall of the Lewis and Clark expedition was through country that had already been explored by Americans and by Brits and others. It was only after they left the Mandan and the Naratsa villages in the spring in the spring of 1805 that they were entering terra incognita. They were moving into that area. Remember those earlier maps I showed you that were blank? This area is entirely unknown. So they didn't know. They knew about these tribes down here, but they didn't know anything really about here. So Jefferson's second question was, or order to Lewis was, tell me who lives out there. Tell me about them. Who are they? Who are they? And of course, behind that was find out, help me understand how might they be an advantage to us in this competition with the British and with the others. And the key to that was trade. Here's a medal, the medals that Lewis and Clark handed out to friendly chiefs, leaders among these various tribes that they would be. Very simple. On the other side, on the verso of this was Jefferson himself, profile of Jefferson himself. And here was the side that showed what he was hoping to accomplish: peace and friendship. So he's saying, number one, be friendly to them, open up friendly trade, friendly relations with them. And the key to those friendly relations is trade. Up there at the top, you see a pipe and a hatchet. You might think the hatchet would mean something of hostility, but no, the hatchet was a primary trade good. So what the symbolizing is, we want to be friends with you, friends, shake hands. We want to have peaceful relations with you, and we want to have peaceful relations to be through trade. You have your document with you. You can read down here, and you can see in more detail what he was talking about. Toward the end of it, that to explore express to them our dispositions for commercial intercourse with them, and confer with them on points most convenient to be emporiums of the articles the most desired for them and us. But what's he saying? What's he saying here? First of all, tell me who lives out there. Second, establish friendly relations with them. Third, explore trade, and specifically points emporiums, that is, trading outposts up there. So he's saying, okay, once we establish this easy route across the continent, up the Missouri, over to the Pacific Northwest, once we do that, then we will establish trading outposts along there and open up relations with these people, which will, of course, cement our alliance with them, specifically through the fur trade. The fur trade during these years was a great international enterprise. It was probably, pardon me again, second only to sugar in the most lucrative international business in the Western world. The British were masters of this. And so one of the things that Jefferson was thinking, well, okay, we got to compete, we got to compete with the big guys, compete with the big league up there in this enterprise. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to compete with the British, with the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, we've got to have certain advantages. And one advantage will be that easy water route. Another one would be if we can establish early on, friendly trade relations, commercial relations with these people. That will be a key. He also wants to know all kinds of things about it. Now, partly this is just an expression of Thomas Jefferson's great curiosity. But all of this, remember, he's thinking imperially. He's thinking imperially. He wants to know, who are these people? Because he's also thinking, how can we use them as our allies? And of course, one step farther than that, how can we dominate them? How can we control them? And to do that, we've got to know a lot about them. specifics. So he's pumping Lewis. He's sending Lewis out there full of these questions to answer. How many are there? How many of them are there? What are their languages and their traditions? What are they? How do they make their living? What are their what were their family relations? How do they build their houses? What do they eat? Every detail that you can imagine. All of this can be filed away and can be satisfy Jefferson's curiosity. It will also be filed away to be used in some way down the line to American advantage in creating our empire out there. Whether that empire is actually controlling that country with our governments, or whether it's an empire of commerce, empire of trade. And they did. This was, in fact, one of the real accomplishments of Lewis and Clark. They brought back an enormous amount of information. A lot of it was wrong. A lot of it was more than that misguided and misunderstood. But they brought back a lot. This is a map composed by William Clark during his time, based on his interviews and sort of pumping the leaders of the Mandans and Adatsas during that long, bitterly cold winter of 1804 to 1805. And you can see the map tells us something geographically. The Indians are telling him about what the lay of the land is out there. But if you're able to zoom in on this map, look more closely at it, you will see things like this. The Cheyennes over here, how many lodges, how many people, how many warriors there are, who their neighbors are, where they all fit together. Here's the Missouri over here. So Clark brought back, this extraordinary library of information, depositor of information. Excuse me, of these people. More specifically, considering the interest in which they have extending and authority, it may be better. How will we be better able to civilize and instruct them to their measures of existing notions and practices among who are to operate? What's he asking here? What's he asking? When he goes back, if you look back at those questions then lead to thinking about, first of all, who's out there, where do they live, who's neighbors to whom, but also how might we be able to insinuate our way into them, become not just their friends and allies and trading partners, but how might we be able to bring them into our culture, our way of life? In other words, how might we be able to convert them to our civilization, bring them into our, not just under our commercial sway, but also bring them into the American life more generally. In other words, how do we missionize them culturally and religiously? One way to do this, he tells Lewis and Clark, if any of these peoples, these leaders out there have any interest whatsoever of coming back to visit us, bring them along. Organize trips where these folks might be able to come back to the East, where we can meet them, where we can show them our hospitality. But of course, the between the lines there, what he's saying is, bring them back here so they can see just how powerful we are, how many of us there are. This will become a policy and a strategy of American leaders from this point on. If you look forward in American Indian relations, you will see time after time after time Indian delegations being brought back to the United States, being feted and entertained, introduced to those in power, and above all, to be shown just how large the American nation was, how powerful it was, the great advantages that we would have to offer them in terms of goods and other things. In other words, to impress them with our power in the name of hospitality, of course, to try to bring them into our sway. Once again, just to hit the point again, he's thinking imperially. He's thinking of an empire in which we would integrate these other peoples into the American empire. Well, the next order, to investigate the soil and the face of the country. At the same time that Lewis and Clark were being told to explore, to seek out this most direct route to the Pacific Northwest in order to allow us to establish ourselves and to steal a march on the British out in Oregon and California, in the Oregon country out there. At the same time that they are being told to meet the native peoples there, to establish friendly relations, to begin to establish commerce with these people, to investigate them in their cultures and their ways of life, and to give us through that an advantage in bringing these people much even more closely beyond commerce, even more closely into the American embrace. Same time they're being told to do all of that, all of this with an eye to American domination of that area out there. At the same time, they were being told to investigate the country itself, describe the country itself. Now, partly this was, once again, a matter of Thomas Jefferson's deep curiosity, as I'm sure you all are aware. Jefferson, was arguably the most learned man in the United States. Our president was the best educated, the most learned man in the nation, which is an unusual thing in itself. But he was a man who was also voraciously curious about everything, and in particular about the West. If you look back at Jefferson's earlier life, you can see time and again, he makes every effort, to learn everything he can about this area out there, about this area that is, as this map says, is entirely unknown. It's as if his mind couldn't stand that. He couldn't stand the fact that he didn't know anything basically about it. So consequently, he wanted to know everything about it. And so Lewis and Clark were told, to bring back specimens, to describe, if possible, to bring back the specimens of living things there, to describe the geography of the place, describe the flora as well as the fauna. They were trained. Lewis in particular, trained before he left with Benjamin Rush and others in the Northeast in Philadelphia. What to look for, how to describe it. Jefferson himself was, of course, a self-taught scientist in many, many different fields. Among other things, he was an early American paleontologist, as a student of ancient life, the discovery of fossils. This illustration here is the excavation of a mammoth skeleton, mammoth skeleton in New Jersey at the time. Jefferson took part in another one of these excavations in Virginia. Jefferson believed, as part of his thought as an as an enlightenment scientist, Jefferson believed that all evolution, certainly believed in evolution, was progressive. That is, things only got better and better over time. And specifically, this meant that animals got larger and larger. Well, Jefferson knew from these excavations that mammoths once lived in New Jersey and Virginia. Well, where were they now? He could not. The way he thought about this did not allow the possibility they would have gone extinct. So he believed that they must be out there somewhere. So among other things, Lewis and Clark were given instructions about how to look for elephants out of the far West. They were given a glossary of words when they met new Indian peoples. They were to ask these people, in your language, how do you say mother? How do you say father? How do you say water? How do you say tree? If you look at that glossary, they also asked these Indians, how do you say elephant? Because they were convinced that elephants were out there. So here's this other instruction that Jefferson gives to Lewis. This one is an expression of Jefferson's own personal passions to explore, to gain new knowledge. But it's important to remember that this was also in its way a kind of empire building, because this competition among nations could be scientific, could be competitions of knowledge, as well as competitions of military competitions or competitions for land and for land rights. Jefferson himself was involved in, had been involved earlier with these vigorous debates and controversies with French scientists. France was considered sort of the center of great scientific learning of that day. And here he was trying to establish the United States, in this case, in terms of scientific prestige, as well as our position in controlling commerce, as well as our position in controlling peoples, native peoples, as well as our position in controlling the land itself, out into the far Pacific Northwest. So it all fits in this larger context of Jefferson's thoughts about empire, Jefferson's thoughts about the American future in this area to the far west, including even bringing back woodpeckers, like Lewis's woodpecker here. Next, inform yourself, and finally here, inform yourself of the country watered by the Missouri branches, especially on its southern side. I should have put that in somehow in bold print. Here in the instructions, the North River, or Rio Bravo, which runs into the Gulf of Mexico. By that he means the Rio Grande there. Also the Rio Colorado, which runs to California. That's the Colorado River, of course. Others, all of these, he said, he believes rose in a. He believed that all of these rivers arose in a great plateau in what's today sort of the Central American Great Plains. That's of course not true. That's what he thought. Again, this was largely unknown territory. So Jefferson thought that if you were to go to what is today Kansas and Nebraska, you would find a great plateau, and that plateau, off of that plateau, running to the north, were rivers running into the Missouri. Right? So Jefferson thought that if Lewis and Clark, as they ascended the Missouri, they would be able to, if they chose to, go south along these rivers flowing into the Missouri from the south, and they would reach this plateau. And he believed that that plateau also had rivers running off it to the south. To the north, they go into the Missouri. To the south, they flow down to the Gulf of Mexico. To the south, they flow down to the Gulf of California. So he believed that things like the Rio Grande, the Colorado River, all flowed off this sort of the central plateau that was accessible via the Missouri. What's he thinking? What is he thinking? Well, the first order, remember, was to go up the Missouri to find that easy route over the Pacific. The Missouri's main purpose would be to give us a route to Oregon, right? But it had this other possibility. In addition to that, that would give us a march on England in the Pacific Northwest. It also opened the possibility of easy access to that plateau, and from that plateau, easy access via those rivers to the south to Texas, to what's today Texas, what's today New Mexico, what's today Arizona, what's today Southern California. In other words, not only was the Missouri a key access to the west and north, the Missouri also held easy access to the south. Not only, in other words, was the Missouri give us an easy advantage against the Brits to the north, it also gave us an advantage against the Spanish to the south. So he was really thinking big here, really thinking big and continentally and imperial here. here again is this map that I showed you earlier. If you look at this more closely, you'll see, before I concentrate on the Missouri that goes up here, but he also sees these other rivers. You can see them going down here. So we can go use it once we control the Missouri. Once we control the Missouri, we would also have easy access down this way against the Spanish. So he was thinking of rivers as the key to empire. Rivers as the key to empire. Empire not just in competition with the English, but also to the Spanish to the south. And in fact, what we often forget is that the Lewis and Clark expedition was one of 4 expeditions sent out under the Jefferson administration to explore this new territory that we had acquired from France in the Louisiana Purchase. Now to the north, Missouri was the key to access to it. The south, in Jefferson's thinking, to the south, the key river was the Red River, which was the southernmost major stream to flow into the Mississippi. In other words, the southernmost stream of the Mississippi watershed to the west. So at the same time that Jefferson was sending Lewis and Clark up the Missouri to try to scout the area up there, there were 3 other expeditions. 2 of them he sent, another one someone else sent, to try to establish ourselves on the Red River to trace the route to the Red River, and more generally to explore the area down there to the southern stretches of the Louisiana Purchase. 1804, the Hunter Dunbar expedition. This is not it. I couldn't find a map of it, but they went up into Arkansas, up into my state, up into the hot springs. They had started to go up the Red River, but they were turned back by the threat of the Spanish over here. The Freeman Custis expedition. This is the one that Jefferson called the Great Expedition. It was funded with more money than that to Lewis and Clark. It's virtually forgotten today. But in Jefferson's mind, this was at least or even more important than the Lewis and Clark expedition. This is to go up the Red River, follow it to its source, to explore that area down there, to give us an advantage against the Spanish in this case. Lewis and Clark, the English, Freeman Custis against the Spanish. Well, they made it as far as very close to the border boundary between Arkansas and Texas today, where they were met by a very large Spanish command. There was an earlier question about the Spanish presence, military presence there. This is about as far north as they were at the time, but they sent a very large command here, and they turned Freeman and Custis back. Now, not sent by Jefferson, but sent in fact by this absolute scoundrel of a commander in New Orleans, as well as Aaron Burr, of the Zebulon Pike expedition, 1806 to 1807. They set off just as Pike set off just as Lewis and Clark were returning. Pike attempted not to go up the Red River itself. He attempted to sort of do an end run to approach it from the north, to go over through the plains, to find the Red River down here, and then follow it. Instead, Pike was arrested by the Spanish. Again, a good illustration of just how touchy they were, just how concerned they were about any threat to this territory. The Pike expedition is a bit controversial still among American historians about what exactly was going on. There's a good bit of a thought that this was part of a conspiracy to create Aaron Burr, among others, to create a sort of republic in Texas to break away. In any case, Pike, arrested by Spanish, allowed to go home. He brought back a good bit of information about that area as well. So the point to remember here is that the Lewis and Clark expedition was one of 4 during these years sent out to explore this area to the west. And the 3 of those 4 were focused down to the south, which in Jefferson's thinking was just as important, arguably more important than the area to the north. Thinking imperially, thinking continentally, thinking in terms of competition with these major European powers. That's the larger context that I want you to take away today. So how well do they do? How do we sum this up? What kind of a grade do we give them? Well, the first thing you can say about it, of course, is they made it. They made it all the way back. They survived with one exception, and that's a major accomplishment. What about that primary goal, that primary order that Jefferson gave them, gave to Lewis? That easy route, easy passage, and communication across the continent to the northwest. Nope. What they found, of course, was that this is an extremely difficult crossing, that there was nothing like that simple chain of mountains with this easy gateway through it. This is a map that Clark brought back. It's a magnificent map showing the complexity of the mountain ranges that they would encounter. Here's the Missouri. They expected to find that easy jump across. No, that's what they found. So he was certainly disappointed in that particular regard. But what you can say, of course, is that they brought, as a result of the expedition, that we ended up with a far more detailed knowledge of what was out there. This was one of the great accomplishments of the expedition, to come back to fill in this blank gap. This place, these parts are entirely unknown. To fill that in with far greater detail than we had before. Here is one of those maps I showed you before. And look at the difference between that and that. Quite the accomplishment. Relation with the Indians, not so good. They brought back a lot of information, but they partly because of events that were far beyond their control, we did not really begin to follow up on relations with the Indians above the Mandans and Hidatsas in that area there until quite a bit later. But we did learn a lot about them. And we began to establish relations, at least with some of them. The Nez Perce people that I've written about elsewhere, first white people, the first non-native peoples they saw were this expedition for Lewis and Clark, whom they saved from starvation. And they became our allies for the next 70 or so years until the Nez Perce War of 1877. So a mixed bag there. They did, if you remember, their goal was the opening up the fur trade through the Indians. The most immediate impact of the expedition was a burst of activity of fur trading up the Missouri River to extent into the Northwest, but also into the Rocky Mountains. So this was one of the most, I think, one of the most significant. What they did then was set in motion these enterprises, this fur trading activity that was really an important first step of American occupation and domination, commercial domination, and also in our relationship with those peoples. So it's a mixed bag, but the point I've tried to get across to you this evening is this question of what's going on here, answering the question, what's going on here? And the answer, I think, has to be understood far larger than the details of this magnificent story itself. This was part of an international competition. It was part of an international exploration of science. It was part of it was an important step in this very turbulent and fluid period for the control of North America, one that eventually would tip in our favor. But partly that it did tip in our favor was partly due to then what this expedition was able to accomplish. Okay, we're right at 7:30, I think. Laura, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we had a couple of questions. One was about whether who would you say of the other explorers in the Louisiana Purchase was the most significant? I assume Lewis and Clark would be the most significant, but other than them, who would you? They were wondering who was more significant of the others.
Well, there were other expeditions among the British up the northwest that were quite significant over time. They were able initially to dominate that area. Unfortunately for Jefferson's hopes. And so, especially through their fur traders, they were able to bring back a very detailed knowledge of that whole area up there. Others that I mentioned, Pike in particular, brought back some maps. He was able to smuggle them out. He rolled up these notes and maps and put them in the barrels of his rifles, of his men's rifles, and snuck those back. And he brought back maps. I could have shown you those as well. That gave us our first remotely detailed information about that the Southwest. So Pike began to fill in the picture of the Southwest in the same way that Clark and Lewis began to fill it in up there to the on the northern plains in the Northwest. This would be followed up in expeditions in the 1820s. Stephen Long onto the Great Plains. Our fur traders would play like this guy here. Would play a great role as they searched out those beavers in the far west. They would bring back far more detailed knowledge than any formal government expedition did of that country. So what they really did, Lewis and Clark did, was to inaugurate a period of about 50 years of extraordinary activity and exploration the far west that would give us a far more detailed knowledge. There would be no more maps that said these parts are entirely unknown after about 50 years after that. So it really the first of several important efforts in that regard.
Great. So there was a question about whether, two questions. One was, was there any interest in westward exploration prior to Jefferson by any previous presidents, or was it just that Jefferson was so curious about scientific and that sort of thing? And the other has to do with whether there were any understandings in place between France and or Spain and the native peoples that maybe had an effect on how we dealt with them.
Well, first question. No presidents before Jefferson, but as I said, Jefferson himself, before he was president, was eaten up with curiosity about this. He made two abortive efforts to have people sent out there to explore this area. One by a remarkable guy named American guy, John Ledyard. He persuaded Ledyard to try to approach our west from Russia. So he tried to walk all the way across Siberia, and then he was going to go into Alaska, what's today Alaska, and down into the far west to approach it from that direction because it was being blocked, and other efforts to move from the east to west were being blocked. He was turned back by the forces of Catherine the Great. So Jefferson himself made all sorts of efforts before he became president to reach into that area. The second question, sure, the Spanish. The Spanish made of course, elaborate relations with Indians of the Southwest and of California. Not so much in the interior. That area of where Lewis and Clark were, and to the south of the Missouri, that area was largely unknown by the Spanish at this time. They have relations with the tribes of the Eastern Plains, Pawnees and the Otos and others Osages over there. The French, of course, had elaborate relations with the Indians of the Upper Missouri. These French traders coming out of Canada, the Hudson's Bay traders, the Mandan and Hidatsa camps, those where Lewis and Clark spent their winter, had long trade relations with the French and then with the British after them. The Mandans and Hidatsas were described as very European looking because they were because the women there had interbred with the French and British traders there for generations. When Lewis and Clark got off their keel boats, they would have seen Mandan and Hidatsa men wearing corduroy trousers, chewing peppermint candy that they had acquired from traders. So, But again, all of this is on the fringes. All of this is on the fringes. Lewis and Clark, once they left the Mandans and the Gossip, spring of 1805, once they left there, they were moving in the country where it was there had been no contact with Indians whatsoever.
Well, this has been fascinating, and I think really helps everybody to have a greater understanding of this really terrific adventure in American history. Do you have a book that you recommend about the Lewis and Clark expedition? And we'll close.
Oh gosh, there's of course.
I know there's so many. I know
there's so many. Well, one thing, of course, the journals themselves, which are voluminous. If the remains, if I would have to say one book that I would suggest folks reading, it remains one that's been around for a long time. James Ronda, Ronda, Lewis and Clark Among the Indians. It remains a fascinating study of the expedition itself, but also specifically, of course, their relations with those Indian peoples. And Jim Ronda, was of his generation. He was the great historian of the expedition. He has many other works since many essays and other books in which will. I've stole a great deal from my good friend Jim in this as well. So read Ronda's stuff.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being such an engaged audience. And we will look forward to a wonderful year of further webinars. And Elliott, thank you. It's been terrific.
You're quite welcome. Good to be with all of you again. And thank you again for tuning in. And good luck for the year.